and Cologne, who became Comptroller General in November 1783, found himself obliged to go on borrowing. Cologne was intendant of Flanders, his native province. Returning there in 1778 after a 13-year absence. On his rise through the administrative hierarchy, he had acquired the reputation of a slippery time server with naked ambitions. But his connections at court were excellent, and he was trusted by Vergennes, now the dominant minister of state. Cologne's appointment was popular at Versailles, and he certainly made no efforts to impose economies on the court, as Turgot and Necker had. Indeed, he believed that lavish spending on useful splendor was good for credit. It appeared to work. Between 1783 and 1787, Cologne was able to borrow over 653 millions. But by 1785, doubts were surfacing about how long this could go on. In that year, Necker published his Administration des Finances, at once a vindication of his own record and an implicit condemnation of Cologne's. The Parliament of Paris, which had not demurred at registering new loans since 1777, objected so vehemently to that of December 1785 that its members had to be called in a body to Versailles and told explicitly by the king that he had the fullest confidence in his Comptroller General. Even so, the loan, despite generous terms, were subscribed only sluggishly, and throughout the spring of 1786, there were persistent rumors in Paris that Cologne was about to be dismissed. The Queen and her favorites were certainly throwing all their influence behind his ministerial rivals. But with Vergennes on his side, he was safe. There appears at present no disposition whatever to economy in the finances of this kingdom, noted the sharp-eyed British chargé d'affaires with some disgust on 24th of August, 1786. Purchases of great value continued to be made, and works of immense expense to be carried on in different royal establishments. Monsieur de Cologne, by his unbounded liberality and complaisance to people of high rank and distinction, supports himself still in his most important situation. But the easing the burdens of the people and the interest of the nation seem to be as perfectly disregarded as they ever were by the most corrupt of his predecessors. He did not know that 4 days beforehand, Cologne had proposed to Louis XVI the most radical and comprehensive plan of reform in the monarchy's history. Cologne claimed that he had been working on his plan for the improvement of the finances for 2 years before he presented it to the king. It certainly took Louis XVI several months to understand it and authorize its implementation. At the outset, Cologne had to convince the monarch that it was necessary at all. In 1786, the Comptroller General explained there would be a deficit of 112 millions, almost a quarter of expected income. Yet, at the end of the year, the third Vantium would expire, and for the next 10, there would be a heavy annual burden of debt redemption on short-term loans raised since the beginning of the American War. Almost half the annual revenue was absorbed by debt service. Well over half the next year's revenue had been spent in advance in short-term loans, anticipations, raised from financiers on the security of expected tax yields, a normal enough practice, but not on this colossal scale. It is impossible, Cologne concluded, to tax further. Ruinous to be always borrowing and not enough to confine ourselves to economical reforms. With matters as they are, ordinary ways being unable to lead us to our goal, the only effective remedy, the only course left to take, the only means of managing finally to put the finances truly in order, must consist in revivifying the entire state by recasting all that is vicious in its constitution. That would involve a 3-part program. First came a series of sweeping fiscal and administrative reforms designed to establish a more uniform order. They centered around the proposal to abolish the existing 3 Vantiums and their various surcharges, along with all the exemptions, compoundings, and special provisions enjoyed by privileged groups and corporations. This complex structure would be replaced by a territorial subvention, a permanent direct tax levied in kind on all landowners with no exemptions. At the moment of harvest, the new tax would be assessed and administered by the taxpayers themselves in provincial representative assemblies, working in cooperation with the intendants. Cologne estimated that this new tax would bring in 35 millions more than the Vantiums, and it would be augmented yet further by a whole range of other innovations, such as an extended stamp tax and better administration of the royal domain. Even more impressive yields could be expected if the taxpayers could be made more prosperous. And Cologne planned to achieve this by the second part of his program, aimed at economic stimulation. Advised by Dupont de Nemours, the former associate of Turgot, Cologne took up several of the physiocratic policies that had lapsed when the latter fell in 1776. He proposed to abandon controls on the grain trade, abolish internal customs barriers, and commute the corvée into a tax where this had not already happened. Vergennes, meanwhile, in September 1786, concluded a free trade treaty with Great Britain, which was expected to benefit French agriculture. But neither these measures nor the fiscal reforms could be expected to show instant results. Time would have to be bought, and the immediate crisis averted by further borrowing. The third part of Cologne's plan was designed to create the confidence to sustain new loans before sending his measures to the parliaments for registration. Cologne proposed to have them endorsed by a show of national consensus, which would disarm any criticism in advance and persuade lenders that the country was behind the minister in his determination to restore financial health. The obvious forum for seeking such support, much discussed since the political crisis of 1771, was the Estates General. Cologne considered the idea, only to reject such an unwieldy body as too unpredictable. Remonstrances from the parliaments were bad enough. Obstruction from people who saw themselves as the nation's elected representatives might be far worse. Besides, precedents also existed for another kind of representative body, an assembly of notables, whose members were all royal nominees and could therefore be hand-picked. They would, of course, be people of weight, worthy of the public's confidence, and such that their approbation would powerfully influence general opinion. But the honor of being chosen alone ought to make them docile, with a public show of backing from the leading men of the kingdom for his plans. Cologne did not doubt that the loans to make them possible would be forthcoming. Louis XVI finally authorized this plan on 29 December 1786. An assembly of notables was ordered to convene at Versailles on 29 January 1787 to consider the king's views on the relief of his peoples, the ordering of his finances, and the reform of various abuses. No other details were given, and speculation ran riot. In the event, the assemblies did not convene until 22nd February, as first Cologne and then Virginius fell ill. Virginius, the only minister who supported Cologne wholeheartedly, died on 13 February. During all these delays, the 144 chosen nominees had plenty of time to get to know each other, and the 64 provincials among them were able to sense the mood of the capital. Less than 10 of the notables were non-nobles. 18 were clerics. 7 were princes of the blood, each assigned to preside over a working party, a bureau. Most of the 36 dukes, peers, and other great lords were generals, provincial governors, and others with experience of authority. But they included ambitious celebrities like Lafayette, the self-proclaimed hero of the American War. There were also 12 senior administrators, 38 sovereign court magistrates, 12 representatives of the Pays d'État, and 25 civic dignitaries. And as soon as they met and heard what the Comptroller General proposed, it became apparent that the notables would not be the meek and ductile collaborators Cologne had expected. Inexperienced as he was in managing political assemblies, he totally miscalculated the forces he had let loose and how to handle them. In a controversial political career, Cologne made many enemies, and they were all well represented in the assembly. Members of the parliaments had been hostile to him ever since the 1760s, when he had been closely involved in authoritarian moves against them. The first president of the Parliament of Paris, a notable like most of his provincial counterparts, was a personal enemy. Leading prelates had been alienated by attempts since 1783 to bully the clergy into increasing its contributions to the royal finances. Yet, in choosing the clerical contingent, Cologne was content to act on the advice of Loménie de Brienne, Archbishop of Toulouse, skilled from years of manipulating clerical assemblies and the estates of Languedoc in the politics of intrigue, and known to harbor his own ministerial ambitions. Only Virginius among Cologne's ministerial colleagues had been fully aware of his plans, and the rest felt no commitment to supporting him. Some hoped to use the assembly to destroy him. Others were known disciples of Necker, and the Swiss wonder worker himself, though not a member of the notables, was a central figure in their deliberations from the very start. He had many admirers in the assembly, and when Cologne, in his opening speech, declared the royal finances were running a substantial deficit, everyone immediately thought of the Compte Rendu. If Necker could achieve a surplus after 3 years of war and no new taxation, why now was there a deficit after 3 years of peace and a third Vantium? Cologne's lavish spending and heavy borrowing were notorious. There was a perfectly reasonable suspicion that if there was a crisis, and at this stage the minister offered no figures to prove that there was, then he was responsible. Yet, if Cologne's proposals had come from anybody else, there is little doubt that the notables would have welcomed them more warmly. They were, after all, more or less the result of all that good minds have been thinking for several years, as Talleyrand put it. And in the event, the vast majority of them were accepted with very little complaint. Criticism was largely confined to the territorial subvention, the provincial assemblies, and a proposal to force the clergy to redeem its corporate debt. Even then, the notables declared themselves unequivocally in favor of the basic principles of equality of taxation and representation of the taxpayers in its assessment and apportionment. But landowners, as all the notables were, they questioned whether a perpetual variable tax falling entirely on people like themselves was fair, and whether the proposal to levy it in kind was practical. And members, as they all were, of the first two orders of the realm, they thought nobles and clergy should be guaranteed a proportion of the seats in the provincial assemblies, and that the work of these bodies, if they were to be truly representative, should not be subject to the veto of the intendants. The bishops finally saw the proposal for redemption of the clerical debt as a prolongation of the ministers' early attacks on the church. They knew that if their debt, incurred on the government's behalf, was liquidated, they would lose the best guarantee of the clergy's time-honored right of self-taxation. They declared themselves incapable of assenting to any changes touching the church without the authorization of the assembly of the clergy. Magistrates, likewise, announced that they could not predetermine the attitude of the sovereign courts they sat in. Most of the notables, indeed, felt uncertain about who they spoke for. "We were not the representatives of the nation," Lafayette later wrote to George Washington, "but we declared that although we had no right to impede It was our right to not advise unless we thought the measures were proper, and that we could not think of new taxes unless we knew the returns of expenditure and the plans of economy. This proved the real sticking point during the first week of the assembly. At first, Cologne contended that since the king had seen the full accounts, they should accept his good faith. The notables countered that in that case, there was no point in soliciting their support. Eventually, on 2nd March, Cologne reluctantly revealed his estimates, and in doing so, he so explicitly condemned the Compte Rendu of 1781 as false and misleading. The Neckerites were outraged, while those who did not know who to believe demanded to see even more detailed accounts in order to make up their own minds. On 3rd of March, the first overt claim that the notables had no power to approve new taxation. That right, declared Leblanc de Castillon, Procurator General of the Parliament of Aix, belonged only to the Estates General. All these proceedings had formerly taken place in secret. The public was agog to have news of the assembly. Rumors abounded, and a good deal of more or less accurate information leaked out. It fueled a flurry of pamphleteering, most of it hostile to the minister. In addition to despotism, profligacy, and incompetence, it was now alleged by the most notorious pen for hire of the day, the dissolute Count de Mirabeau, that Cologne was also guilty of shady stock exchange dealings. This atmosphere encouraged the notables in their demand for full accounts, and in detailed criticism of Cologne's plan. They were all the more scandalized. Therefore, when on 12th of March, he blandly observed at a plenary session that the king was glad to note their broad approval. Despite vehement protests, Cologne proceeded to publish this speech, which proved the first sign of a fundamental change of tactics. Having failed to browbeat the notables in private, he now attempted to take advantage of the intense public interest to subject them to outside pressure. On 18th of March, he sponsored a pamphlet calling for the full proceedings of the assembly to be made public. On 31st of March, with the ground thus prepared, he published the full original texts of his proposals. They were accompanied by an introduction, avertissement, which was also separately printed and circulated free to parish clergy, with the request that they read it from the pulpit. It was clearly designed to arouse public suspicion about the motives of Cologne's critics. The notable's doubts it implied were mere pretexts. We will be paying more, no doubt, but who? Only those who were not paying enough. They will pay what they owe according to just proportion. And nobody will be overburdened. Privileges will be sacrificed. Yes, justice demands it. Need requires it. Would it be better to put further burdens on the unprivileged, the people? There will be a great outcry. That was to be expected. Can general good be done without bruising a few individual interests? Can there be reform without some complaints? But this bold attempt to foment social antagonisms against the minister's leading critics fell flat. The notables sent further indignant protests to the king, and the public proved completely unresponsive to Cologne's appeal. It was received as a desperate last throw of a discredited political gambler. And so it proved to be. Even the king was now dismayed by the lack of progress in the assembly and his ministers' seeming inability to convince anyone of his honesty and good intentions. Courtiers, ministerial rivals, and men of ambition moved in for the kill. Louis XVI, committed to the reforms, resisted to the last. And on the morning of 8th of April, he dismissed Miromesnil, head of the judiciary, and his longest-serving minister, ostensibly for failing to support Cologne. But later that day, the Comptroller General himself was dismissed. The king had clearly concluded that only new men could hope to push any reforms at all through. And the general celebration which greeted the news of Cologne's fall certainly seemed to promise an improvement in the political atmosphere. But finding a replacement did not prove easy. Miromesnil was succeeded by Lemoynon, a member of the notables, long known as one of the more able presidents of the Parliament of Paris and an advocate of judicial reforms. The appointment was popular, but the central problem confronting the state was financial. Incapable men willing to take over the fallen minister's program were not so readily found. Necker was still the public's favorite, but the king disliked him. On the very weekend of Cologne's dismissal, he had flouted express royal instructions not to publish a vindication of the Compte Rendu against the minister's attacks. He was exiled from Paris for his effrontery. The other obvious candidate was Brienne, who from the start had hoped to use the notables as a stepping stone to power. The king disliked him too, but after entrusting the finances for 3 weeks to a bureaucratic non-entity who proved quite unable to handle the notables, he yielded. Informed that royal stock was steadily falling, and that without some gesture to restore confidence, credit might soon run out, the king, on 1st of May, appointed Brienne chief of the Royal Council of Finances. A successful credit revived instantly. Nobody seemed more likely to be able to engineer a successful outcome to an experiment that had already gone seriously wrong than one of the notables' own most capable, intelligent, and flexible members. Brienne himself was also confident of success. He thought that if the territorial subvention could be modified to a tax in cash yielding a prearranged amount over a set and limited number of years, and if the clergy and nobility could be guaranteed seats in the provincial assemblies, the notables would be satisfied. He presented these modifications to leading members of the assembly on 9th of May. But during the ministerial upheavals of the preceding month, the notables had done little but scrutinize the accounts. And the more they saw, the more confused they had become. Before agreeing even to a modified version of the Cologne plan, they now insisted that the true condition of the finances must be established beyond dispute. The best way of achieving this, more and more of them were coming to believe, was through a permanent commission of auditors. Brienne had no objections to the idea, but the king thought it an unacceptable infringement of his prerogative. He vetoed it. His decision brought all constructive activity in the assembly to an end. They had no authority. The notables now declared to consent to or authorize new taxes. It seems to me, declared Lafayette in the bureau where he sat on 21st May, that this is the moment for us to beseech His Majesty to fix immediately, in order to render account to him of all measures and settle their happy outcome forever, the convocation of a truly national assembly. What, sir? Burst out the Count d'Artois, the king's brother. Are you calling for the Estates General? Yes, my lord, replied the young glory hunter, and even better than that. This now became the universal cry, and Brienne quickly recognized that no further progress with the notables was likely. They had to be brought to an end before irreparable damage was done. And on 25th May they were. In an uncontested closing speech, Brienne announced that he intended to press on with the modified territorial subvention. The provincial assemblies and various other measures in the plan originally formulated by Cologne. Having so ringingly declared that they represented nobody, the notables had no alternative to accepting their dismissal on these terms. At least, the mayor of Montauban explained, "You cannot say we have voted for any taxes." Nevertheless, the assembly was a turning point. It marked the beginning of a political crisis that was only to be resolved by revolution, convoked to deal with hitherto unacknowledged financial problems. Its 3-month sitting revealed in rare detail to the country and to the world how serious they were. The effect was to throw public doubt on the capacity of absolute monarchy to manage the nation's affairs and to encourage subsequent resistance to any measures the crown might propose. Brienne saw this clearly enough. If the assembly of notables, he had predicted to the king, who agreed on 16th April, separates without having assured a balance between receipts and expenses, it becomes necessary after its separation to have recourse to taxes. It is to be feared that great resistance will be encountered. This assembly was called because it was judged that its opinion would overcome all foreseeable obstacles. Lack of that opinion would produce much the same effect as outright opposition. But opposition there had been, and it had culminated in loud calls for the institution which Cologne had ruled out in his original strategy as too dangerous, the Estates General. This stance was bequeathed to future opponents of the government's plan, and it was extremely popular. The unprecedented political spectacle of the Assembly of Notables had involved public opinion in politics to an extent not seen since 1771. And this time, the interest aroused did not die away. Cologne himself had helped to sustain it by his ill-judged attempt to bring pressure on the notables with the avertissement. His fall from power discredited him entirely and vindicated the notables in public esteem. The parliaments, which were now required to register the modified remnants of his plan, knew that the public expected a resolute show of opposition. Brienne's ministry. In August, he was awarded the title of Principal Minister, unused since 1726. Also felt obliged to press ahead with a program of reforms. After all, the difficulties which had led Cologne to formulate his original plan, the lapse of the third vingtième and heavy debt redemptions falling due, were still there. And although the Archbishop's arrival in power revived credit sufficiently to float a successful new loan in early May, it could only be a stopgap. Besides, the international situation had suddenly darkened over the spring. The Dutch Republic had been teetering on the brink of civil war for 4 years as self-styled patriots sought to curtail the constitutional role of the stadtholder William V of Orange. Virginia's policy had been to support the patriots, but the British and the Prussians were now encouraging a princely counter-offensive. To lend the patriots further support might require military intervention, with all its attendant costs. Some resolution of the budgetary crisis was therefore a matter of increasing urgency. The ministry began to send its measures for registration in the parliaments at the end of June. Some of them encountered little resistance. Free trade in grain, the commutation of the corvée into a tax, and even the edict setting up provincial assemblies passed in Paris without trouble. Only the Parliament of Bordeaux, which had been on record since 1779 as an advocate of strong provincial estates for the province of Guyenne, voiced more than formal reservations about the vagueness of the powers these assemblies were to exercise. It refused to register this or anything else until they were clarified. But the focus of public attention was the Parliament of Paris, where, thanks to its status as the Court of Peers, no fewer than 21 former notables were entitled to sit and opine. Everybody knew that the real battle would be joined over the taxation edicts, which were the kernel of the government's program. First to arrive on 2nd of July was the extension of stamp duty. And on this, the Parliament clearly established its general position. It refused to register until the government justified the tax increase by producing accounts. The king replied that there were enough former notables in the court to know how matters stood. In any case, the Parliament had no right to vet the royal finances. He ordered immediate registration. Instead of that, however, the Parliament decided to send further remonstrances in which it declared itself incapable of sanctioning a perpetual tax. That right belonged solely, it declared, to the Estates General, rather than take issue with this argument. The government now sent the territorial subvention for registration. It, too, was rejected after a long discussion, not unanimously, but by a clear majority, on 30th of July. Again, the States General were called for, and there was no doubting the popularity of the magistrates' stand. Great crowds assembled whenever the Parliament met. The salons of high society were almost unanimous in urging the magistrates to keep up their opposition. And all over the capital, political clubs and discussion groups were mushrooming, reading together, and sometimes sponsoring an ever-swelling flow of pamphlets and broadsheets, now appearing at a rate of more than one a day. When the government decided on August 6 to force registration of the new taxes in a lit de justice, the ceremony was held at Versailles, away from the rebellious atmosphere of the capital. On this occasion, a whole program of administrative economies was announced, in the hope of softening the blow of a forced registration, and the atmosphere was so calm that Louis XVI snored audibly through much of the proceedings. But back in Paris the next day, the biggest crowd anyone could remember thronged the Palace of Justice as the Parliament debated its response. It declared the forced resignation null and illegal. 3 days later, it voted to proceed against Cologne for criminal mismanagement of public funds. And on the 13th, it condemned the forcibly registered laws once more to thunderous applause. Ministers were now growing alarmed. Even those who had doubted the wisdom of so rapid a recourse to a lit de justice recognized that the crown must quickly recapture the initiative and calm the effervescence in the capital. So they all supported the next step, a time-honored one in conflicts with the sovereign courts. On 15th of August, the Parliament was exiled to Troyes. Defiant though the leaders of the Parliament felt, none of them thought of resisting the royal orders. History suggested that exiles were never permanent and were usually ended by some compromise or even surrender on the crown's part. Older and more hesitant magistrates willingly complied in the hope that a calmer atmosphere would now descend. But initially, there were tumultuous protests in Paris, led by law clerks thrown out of work by the transfer of legal activity to the provinces, forced resignation of the tax edicts in other Parisian sovereign courts, carried out by the king's brother, produced catcalls, jostling, and clashes with the prince's escort of guards. In the days following, there was open defiance of the city police and talk of a mass march to Versailles. The abuse bestowed on the king and queen and the Archbishop of Toulouse, noted an English observer, is incredible, but the government continued to act with newfound vigor. All clubs were now closed. Booksellers were ordered to clamp down on unauthorized publications. Troops cleared the Palace of Justice and began to patrol the streets day and night. Meanwhile, proceedings against Cologne were quashed, although by now he had fled to England. And to show that the new firm policy applied outside the capital too, the Parliament of Bordeaux was exiled to Le Borgne, a small town some distance from its normal seat. By the first week in September, the government appeared to be back in control, although the Paris Parliament had ordered its subordinate courts not to register or publish the tax edicts, and protests were now pouring in from provincial parliaments about the whole drift of royal policy. What the government could not control was the situation in the Dutch Republic. There, a confrontation between the Hohenzollern Princess of Orange and the Patriots at the end of June had led to a Prussian ultimatum. On 13 September, Prussian troops crossed the frontier with the open connivance of Great Britain. And by the beginning of October, they were masters of the entire republic. French intervention to support the Patriots was generally expected. The political conversation of every company I have seen, observed Arthur Young on 16 September, is much more on the affairs of Holland than on those of France. But on 28 September, the French Foreign Secretary Montmorin admitted that there was no possibility of intervention. The financial crisis had meant that throughout the summer, no proper preparations had been made. The contrast with the resolute days of Vergennes was glaring, another blow to the government's prestige. A lasting resolution of the country's internal problems offered the only serious prospect of restoring it. Le Moignon who dreamed of a comprehensive reform of the French law, was beginning to talk about action on the scale of Maupeou to break the Parliament's powers of resistance once and for all. Brienne preferred negotiation with the exiles of Troy, sensing that many of the magistrates had been pushed by the electric atmosphere of the capital beyond what they knew were the limits of wisdom. Besides, by mid-September, he had elaborated a new plan. Ever since the notables, the Crown's leading critics, had been calling for full accounts and drastic economies as prerequisites of new taxation, he now proposed to offer both in the context of a 5-year program designed to restore financial health by 1792. Neither the stamp tax nor the territorial subvention he now announced were necessary to the success of this plan, provided the 2 existing vantiums could be prolonged and levied on a more equitable basis. He therefore offered to terminate the Parliament's exile and withdraw the 2 new taxes in return for registration of the prolongation of the old. A majority of magistrates was persuaded to agree. On 20 September, accordingly, the exile was revoked, and the Parliament entered at once upon its normal autumn vacation. It was understood that on reassembling in November, it would be presented with a new loan edict intended to keep the government afloat during its 5-year retrenchment. Public reaction to this compromise was a mixture of skepticism and disgust. Although the Parliament had declared once again, in agreeing to prolong the vantiums, that only the Estates General could sanction new taxation, it appeared by the very act of registration to have abandoned that principle. The provincial parliaments, who had rallied round their exiled colleagues, felt betrayed, especially that of Bordeaux, which remained in exile. The law clerks of Paris spent 3 days and nights celebrating the end of the exile with fireworks and bonfires, where Cologne was burned in effigy. But pamphleteers were less flattering. Hostility to the government continued unabated. The feeling of everybody, Arthur Young recorded in Paris on 13th of October, seems to be that the Archbishop will not be able to do anything towards exonerating the state from the burden of its present situation. Some think that he has not the inclination, others that he has not the courage, others that he has not the ability. By some, he is thought to be attentive only to his own interests, and by others that the finances are too much deranged to be within the power of any system to recover, short of the States General of the kingdom, and that it is impossible for such an assembly to meet without a revolution in the government ensuing,